I, I appreciate the invitation. I do have a lot of affection for this firm and this product. And yeah, as you say, I've been in security for a long time. Anytime somebody stands up and says, oh, I've been in security for 20 years, the next thing you should ask them is, well, why haven't you fixed it? And I deserve that, and others perhaps here deserve that as well. You've been at it so long, why isn't it done? And I'm afraid that I've come to the conclusion it's never going to be done, so the question is, well, then what? And so that's what I'm going to try to talk about now. And I'm of the habit of these days of writing out what I'm going to say. And I've given this to Suzanne, so if you want this actual text, you're welcome to it. Like the Jay Leno advertisement, use it for what you want, we'll make more. So let me just begin. Data, as you know, is everywhere. We're positively swimming in it. When we're all writing our memoirs or telling our grandchildren what we used to do, I think at least some of us will say that the most far-reaching change that occurred in our lifetime was to remove the physicality of data, to make it electronic rather than paper-based, and to take the copying, the handling, the transmission, the distribution, and the accessibility from a world of physical reality to a world of electronic reality, a world that leaves behind all that physicality. And I do think that's probably the most profound change over the course of my lifetime. It's sort of needless to say this, but this is irreversible. And even if at the same time it's proof that there are no advantages that don't come with disadvantages, and no unalloyed advantages, as my father used to say. You know, data's role in society today is something between a raw material and an economic good, and it can only become more so, both as to raw material and as to being an economic good. The percentage of total corporate wealth that is data itself is probably rising, which is to say that the value of data is rising faster than the market capitalization of the companies that hold it. If you look at the Dow Jones Industrial Average over the long haul, the 70-year kind of long haul, it rises at about 1% a month. We are rising faster than that, and I'll come to numbers shortly. The most lasting evolutionary changes are changes where a competitive advantage to the few becomes a competitive necessity for the many. And I think that's true with data. Data has gone from being a competitive advantage for the few who could get and handle data and do it well, when getting and handling data was a rare skill, to a checkoff. That is to say, if you can't get and handle data in large quantities, you're likely not to be long for the business world. It is hard to think of a growth industry of any sort that isn't substituting data for other forms of assets, and it isn't relying on data acquisition and data handling for efficiencies of all kinds and at all levels. The global realities of data acquisition and data handling have allowed supply chains to both lengthen, yet to also become more efficient, raising living standards on a worldwide basis, even while sowing the seeds of economic consolidation. Is it any wonder that there is an executive whose worry is data or information or knowledge or whatever you want to call it in every modern firm of any size? Even the general lay public has some sense of what we call Moore's law, which in its simplest form, as you well know, describes what happens in the industrial lab and then subsequently in the field, namely a halving of the price of a fixed amount of computer power about every 18 months. This so-called law has been in place for a couple of decades. It's holding up to a large degree, but not entirely. But if nothing else, it has driven the change from a physical data world to an electronic data world. Nothing like that has ever happened before. And it indeed did change everything, as with the theme of this meeting. At the same time, there are two unnamed sisters of Moore's law. The one predicts a faster, perhaps in round numbers, 12-month doubling of how much storage you can buy per unit cost, and the other a faster still, perhaps 9-month doubling, at least in the laboratory, of what you can buy for network bandwidth. None of those three, the 18, the 12, and the 9, is precise, and none of these is certain. But all of these are good enough working approximations for us to say something about data and data's future. What they collectively say is this: the economically optimal computer is changing and will continue to change in the same direction as long as these proportionalities, as long as these curves hold up. The starting point is today, whenever you read or think about this, and it normalizes every curve to today's price-performance ratio for CPU storage and bandwidth. If the doubling rate does stay at 18, 12, and 9, and it holds up for a decade, what you get is that 10 years from now, the compute power per dollar will indeed have gained 2 orders of magnitude. But the value for data storage will have gained 3, and for network bandwidth 4. Put differently, if we keep building computers like we do today, a decade from now, the CPU will have only 1/10 as much power per bit of data as it has today. Potential data volume will have risen by a factor of 1,000, and yet even if all that potential becomes real data, it can be moved off or onto the current computers at 1/10, in 1/10 the time it takes now. Is there any doubt that the computing environment of the future is data rich, and yet the data is more mobile than ever? Well, there is no doubt. An orders of magnitude rearrangement between horsepower to volume to velocity will make data-centric security the central preoccupation for the corporate leader. But there's a more important reason for that corporate leader to pay attention, and that is that data has value. The value of data is hard to pin down, but paraphrasing Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart's comment about obscenity, I may have a hard time defining the value of data, but I know it when I see it. And of course, some data has much more value than others. The 2 economists, Adam Smith and Ronald Coase, describe the nature of our economic interactions. Smith, with his millennial ideal of small producers trading amongst themselves in the mutual self-interest of wealth maximization, and Coase with his explanation of why the millennium doesn't arrive. Coase observed, in particular, that economically viable firms expand until intra-firm coordination costs exceed inter-firm transaction costs. That is to say, until they get big enough that it is cheaper to buy than to build. Putting it in biologic analogy, cells grow until their surface to volume ratio crosses a survivability threshold. While it is unarguably clear that the internet does spectacularly lower transaction costs, it lowers coordination costs more. And it does so by way of an ever greater quantities of information that are ever more mobile. In this, the internet has enabled global consolidation on a scale never before seen, at a speed never before witnessed. But whether the internet is why data has value, or data is why the internet has value, is now very nearly moot. They are permanently conjoined. As if that were not enough, data has a pronounced network effect. More data does make existing data more valuable. Perhaps we should say can rather than does, insofar as there's obviously a great deal of data that could just as soon go away as not. But think about this for a minute. The idea of putting data together, or data fusion, as a statistician would call it, is proving time and again to have such amazing power that it is a source of wealth, think credit reporting, and a source of political friction, think the question of communications metadata. If this is a correct inference to draw, that data exhibits a network effect, then the amount of data should accelerate, while the value of that data should accelerate faster still. Well, the amount of data is certainly accelerating. On the one hand, the percentage of corporate IT budget spent on data is increasing, and on the other hand, what those budget monies buy is increasing faster still. Factoring in replacement of existing hardware, the deletion of old data, the acquisition of new storage, and the collection of new data, some industry analyst groups estimate that total retained data is doubling somewhere like every 2 years, plus or minus a few months, depending on who you're listening to. Those are big numbers. And there aren't any trade magazines left that don't talk about big data on every page. The value of data in the aggregate is certainly growing, and this is before the coming wave of pervasive sensor networks, which now seem inevitable. Ask yourself, what is the liquidation value of, for example, an automated drug discovery firm? Is it not, 1, the contents of its chemistry database, and 2, the resale value of its used wet lab? Does not the chemistry database's value increase with time, while the value of the used wet lab declines? What is valuable about a bank that isn't either data or reputation? It certainly isn't the paper or the furniture. Just finding data and pushing data about has made search engines very rich, very fast. In 2003, Lyman and Varian at UC Berkeley estimated that total retained data approximated 800 megabytes of new information per person per year, or a total of just under 5 new exabytes in the whole world aggregate. In 2012, 9 years later, IBM estimated that total retained value approximated 122,000 megabytes of new information per person per year, or about 800 new exabytes in a whole world aggregate. Assuming Berkeley's and IBM's numbers are equally competent, over the intervening decade, that means a compound annual growth rate of 57%. And as IBM pointed out, that in turn would mean that 90% of all data in the world was created in the last 2 years, and that statement can be said at any time. But you all know that, at least in general. The implication, the takeaway of that, if you want to call it back of the envelope calculation, says that the amount of your labor, your attention, your budget that can be spent per unit of data has to be falling very fast. In other words, cost effectiveness and scalability of your data protection scheme has to keep up. Perhaps the growing importance of data and data security trails the growth rate of data volume and data mobility, but it must follow a curve of its own, a curve that follows the other two, and will grow faster than data volume does because the value of data grows faster than its volume. Data is our focus because data is where the value is. That value is growing, and that value is only seized when it is used, when data changes from at rest to in motion. Data security is thus our job, because all that value can be, like the movie title, gone in 60 seconds. Data is only as good as its integrity, its confidentiality, and its availability, that long familiar and classic triad. At the same time, some data is indeed more valuable than others. Under the pressure of volume growth compounded with value growth, being able to identify and then to protect that which matters most is our challenge. What might that be? Well, security, like freedom, is a term of many meanings. Perhaps every term that is really important has lots of meanings. In any case, we need to talk about security and about how thinking about security is different than thinking about other things. For this part of the discussion to be useful, it has to be kept simple. My own definition of security has evolved over time. Maybe time changes everything in that sense too. Today it is that a state of security is the absence of unmitigatable surprise. Let me repeat that. The state of security is the absence of unmitigatable surprise. As such, the planning and execution of data security is about setting the limits on possible futures, limits that seem worth the trouble and expense to put in place. If such planning must trade flexibility for predictability, then that trade should be under the most optimal conditions that can be negotiated. In other words, security is about means and not ends. Security is not itself an end, the way, say, healthy grandchildren, selling your company, or saving a soul might be thought of as an end. As a wise man said, the cost of anything is the foregone alternative, and so it is with security. For many mature firms, whether that is mature in age, market, market control, technological sophistication, etc., security can be thought of as a subset of reliability, the logic of which is this: an insecure system will not be reliable. Hence, security is necessary for reliability. But a reliable system may be insecure, hence security is insufficient for reliability, and so security is a proper subset of reliability. Now that comment is hardly intended to be profound. It's offered to underpin the definition of security that we will work with for the sweep of this talk. Security is about the absence of surprises that can't be mitigated. As such, security that is well thought is security that changes the probability of surprise while foregoing as little as possible. We've already said that data is only as good as its integrity, its confidentiality, its availability, that classic triad again. Risking pedantry, I should be clear that what those three words mean, though your intuition is almost surely sound here. By integrity, I simply mean the preservation of data for its intended use, and thus the avoidance of surprising alternatives. By confidentiality, I mean the data is accessible only to those who should have that access, and thus avoidance of yet other surprising alternatives. And by availability, I mean whether the data is ready to go at an unpredictable time while avoiding a third set of surprising alternatives. There are other ways to define these terms, but for the kind of data security we're thinking of and trying to solve, these are good enough. We leave it to philosophers to worry about further precision because we have jobs to do. And that is perhaps the main point. We all have jobs to do, and security is about getting those jobs done. Security is not the job itself, though insecurity can produce work that must be done before anything else can be. We are trying, in other words, to manage our risk, not to eliminate it. Total risk elimination is bound to be highly diseconomic and likely to be temporary at best. Managing risk is, of course, hard to argue with, and yet as prone to sloppy thinking and sloppy practice as anything else. But risk management is what we have to do. And this is the point, risk management is what we have to do precisely because security is not an end, but rather a means. If it were an end, we might well want to make absolutist statements or set absolutist goals. But it is not an end, and if we treat security as an end, we then invite that situation where the best is the enemy of the good. Security is not an end, it is a means. Today, what makes security as means hard is the self-same increase in data value and data mobility. Data value is what makes data worth stealing. Data mobility is what makes data theft possible. Networks, having made everyone effectively equidistant, have also exposed the interior of the corporate enterprise to outsiders in ways that do not happen in a paper world. Computer automation has made friend and foe alike more powerful, creating wealth in the one case and putting wealth at risk in the other. CNN estimates that of all adult Americans, 40% have had a credit card replaced in the last year, just to take an example. This tension between insider and outsider does have at least one truly crucial insight that must be central to our thinking about corporate security. An effective internal security regime largely solves the problem of the external attacker as a side effect. Why? Because the first measure of success of an external attacker is to gain the credentials, access, and authority of an insider. If your security regime is proof against internal attacks, then even if your outer perimeter is breached, the impact on your firm will be no more than that which an inside attacker could cause. If you want a thought experiment, try this one. Take your employee with the most control over your internal data, that might be you, humiliate him or her, throw him out on the street, and dare him to do anything. If your internal security regime stands up to that kind of challenge, then you are already aware of a central point, that access without limits creates the very surprises of which insecurity is made of. There are lots of articles and viewpoints and so forth about security, even so, enough so that it is a miracle that you're sitting here listening to yet another. If data security were an easy problem, then it would already be codified down to something like the National Electric Code. Attempts to that have been made, and mostly they are, I think by necessity, all about procedural correctness rather than outcomes. That inability to say you must be this secure, like you must be this tall to ride, comes of course from the rapid rate of change and from our inability to measure. The rapid rates of change makes a craftsman approach ineffective, as you cannot practice the arcane art long enough to be a master of it before it has moved on. The inability to measure makes it hard to keep score, and no game playing improves without published scores. So where next? Well, it can't be just buying more of the same. As Albert Einstein is famously quoted as having described insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, I'd say he's right, and it applies here. He also said that if we knew what it was we were doing, it would not be called research now, would it? And that means that there really is a research-like quality to being a security practitioner. In fact, I think being a security practitioner is quite possibly the most intellectually difficult profession on the planet. With those things in mind, that we can't just keep doing more and more of what we are doing, and that to get beyond security being a research problem, we have to know what it is we are trying to do. Let's try to rethink that problem. Let's try to get a new abstraction, one that is better and not merely different, one that we can measure. We've all heard of a solution looking for a problem. As someone who sees lots of companies, I will tell you that there is a current surge in the number of security startups, many of which are, in fact, as I just said, solutions looking for a problem. And we've all had interviews with salespeople who were hawking cool things that were more cool than they were valuable. We've all read about this or that boondoggle where good money followed bad and delivery rates receded with each new infusion of cash. We also had our own experience with products where what they do and what it was said that they do didn't match for very long. In most, if not all of these cases, the outcome can be traced back to solving the wrong problem. Sometimes this is bad luck, sometimes ignorance, sometimes mission creep, sometimes chutzpah, sometimes egotism. Regardless of why, the effect is the same. Some problem gets solved, but it is not the problem that matters. How do we avoid this? With data security, to get the problem statement right is in fact hard. We are not starting from scratch. There's a lot of infrastructure already in place. Some things are untouchable. Some of the most important decisions have had very subtle arguments behind them for which the logic has been lost. To understand where in security we are, we have to know how we got here. Otherwise, momentum alone will carry us to further decisions, whether we mean it to or not. Here is the punchline. A lot of security technologies deserve no further investment. It is time for change. A colleague and I, Mukul Parikh is his name, run the Index of Cybersecurity. It is a subjective index in the same way that the Consumer Confidence Index is a subjective index. We ask a pool of CISOs and similar folks about 24 questions every month, and they're the same every month. And we then compute a number that we publish at 6 p.m. on the last calendar day of the month. You might find it interesting, and of course, we're always looking for more participants. I would love some of you to do that, and we promise full anonymity, by the way. Each month, nevertheless, we ask one extra one-time question as well. 2 years ago, we asked our respondents what percentage of the security products they already present in their organizations would they buy again if they were starting over from scratch. The answer was 35% of the products installed would be jettisoned. That's a 35% buyer's remorse. That's fairly high as these things go. That is either a lot of obsolescence or a lot of buyer's remorse or something else again. For security to add value, it must offer calibrated economic trade-offs between rational valuation of information and the differential costs of its protection. It has to make sense economically, or it doesn't last. We thus define our problem as the maximum protection at the minimum cost, a so-called Minimax solution. Optimization of spend, if you prefer that kind of construction. This can be more security for the same price, less price for the same security, or something in between. These are just economic facts of life, in other words. There are two analytic paths to a Minimax solution: cost-benefit and cost-effectiveness. Cost-benefit analysis compares costs and benefits with the idea of getting the maximum benefit for the minimum cost, consistent with this Minimax viewpoint. Where there are multiple alternatives, cost-benefit analysis requires that costs and benefits be calibrated to a common currency. It doesn't matter what currency, so long as it puts all alternatives on a common scale. Cost-benefit analysis attempts to answer the question, should we spend the money for this product or not? Cost-benefit questions, however, tend to be hard to answer. For example, how many US dollars is a human life worth? Would you rather have an afternoon to yourself or 100 gallons of gas? Would you rather have cheap timber or wilderness? Closer to home, is a blemish-free record of data handling proof that you're spending too much on security? By contrast, cost-effectiveness analysis first fixes the cost and then seeks what you can get for that cost. Instead of, would you spend $1 million for 5 more years of life, cost-effectiveness says, you have $1 million that you must spend. Would you rather have 10 more years of life at half of your current energy level or 5 years at full steam? Would you rather your relatives visited twice for 1 week or once for 2 weeks? Are more lives saved by spending $100 million on safer cars or $100 million on traffic enforcement? Perhaps it's obvious that cost-effectiveness analysis is more tractable everywhere, while cost-benefit is only tractable for those cases where the conversion of value to a common currency can be reasonably expected to converge. Because cost-effectiveness analysis does not depend on settling matters of taste, like how much is a human life worth, cost-effectiveness analysis is much akin to looking at trend data, whereas cost-benefit analysis is more like looking at raw measurements. So what does a commitment to cost-effectiveness get us in the case of data security? The more open the corporation's business model, the more data matters, and hence the more data security matters. In turn, the more that data security matters, the more it is essential to acknowledge the insider threat. This shifts what Minimax problem is that optimal security is positioned to solve, what an effective solution looks like, and what it costs. In a corporate setting such as yours, it is especially valuable when a budget is more like a block grant and less like a list of earmarked projects. Information security costs are of two kinds: anticipation costs and failure costs. Anticipation costs are the monies you spend to avoid problems. Failure costs are the monies you spend for repair and or recourse. Zero spend on anticipation maximizes spend for remediation, while near infinite spend on anticipation zeroes out failure costs. Any given strategy will be a mix of voluntary spending on anticipation plus involuntary spending on failure. The total cost of security will thus be the sum of the cost curves for anticipation and for failure. A Minimax solution for security spend will be the low point on that curve that maps the sum of anticipation and remediation costs. Your curves for remediation and for failure, and thus the Minimax solution, are themselves subject to other forces, particularly the degree of electronic collaboration and coordination you have with your customers, suppliers, trading partners, and the like. If you have little or no collaboration, then failure costs will be small, and thus anticipation costs are what drive optimal spend. If your collaboration is massive, failure costs will likewise be massive, and so failure costs, not anticipation costs, will drive optimal spend. Put differently, as collaboration increases, the optimal spend increases, but the Minimax solution will still be found in the same way. It will be the job of a cost-effectiveness analysis to understand the summed curve, but let's first look at where these costs come from. Anticipation costs mount upward in reaction to a steady stream of new risks, and to a lesser extent, increasing virulence of existing risks. When each then new class of risk arose, someone thought up a new class of product to deal with that risk. That past predicts our future, though of course a new class of risk is not a daily occurrence, even though it has happened more than once in the work lifetime of everyone here. It is thus instructive to understand the anticipation costs contributed by the most common products protecting against the most common classes of threats. Any all-inclusive discussion needs to embrace the total cost of ownership concept, but we do not need a specific methodology for computing a TCO, just the acknowledgement that one exists and it is multifaceted. These facets include, 1 point, for any control system in the real world, exception handling is more expensive than routine management. Under the downward price pressure of automation, the spread between cost of exception handling and the cost of automated routine management is broadening over time. Exception handling costs therefore deserve the greatest management focus as their relative share of TCO rises as other shares fall. Another point, the urgency of security grows as the value of the product being protected times the magnitude of the threat. If both value and threat are growing, the urgency of security grows especially quickly. Another point, the minimal product mix is one that barely covers all requirements, thereby limiting capitalization and routine maintenance costs. If there were no exception handling, we would be done now. And a last point, where there is exception handling, the best situation is where the exception handling of any one product is preempted by the routine processing of another. A different topic than today, but that is why it's generally known, for example, as defense in depth. To really nail down our Minimax solution, we will need 1, to calculate a cost for defense, and 2, to put a value on our information. The typical melange of security products is growing less cost effective, by which I mean antivirus and firewalls and intrusion detection and patch management. They're no longer really able to withstand the risk pressure that our adversaries can bring to bear. Each of those 4 main technologies does what it does, but each faces an ever more challenging operational setting. TCO for each of the 4 is overwhelmingly dominated by the costs of management and not by the initial purchase of software licenses. In all of antivirus, firewalls, intrusion detection, and patch management, you don't get a lot of data for management beyond counting the number of alarms or the number of patches to be pushed down or the list of potential intrusions that have to be investigationally proven to be false positives and so forth. In other words, each of those systems does an incomplete job, and what news it brings you is bad news, while with the exception of past management, none of them can help you fix anything. Each may be perfect at what it does, but the failure of any is the failure of all. Failure costs in information protection are proportional to information value per se. These costs are some combination of the aftermath from a loss of data integrity, which is to say unauthorized modification, a loss of data confidentiality, which is to say unauthorized exposure, and a loss of data availability, which is to say unauthorized blocking of access to data. These costs are both a function of time, how long before you detect and or how long before you repair, assuming that you can repair, and a function of value. While everyone agrees that information is valuable, that is generally as far as the agreement goes. In the study of statistics, a difficulty in figuring the value of X may sometimes be avoided by figuring the value of 1 minus X, which is to say by solving a problem through changing your point of view to one where the problem is tractable, yet the solution is equivalent. For example, how much is your brand worth? Won't get a consensus answer in any boardroom I'm familiar with, but re-abstracting the question to, if you were starting from scratch, what's the minimum money and time it would take to build a brand as good as the one you have now? That might get you a consensus, or at least a consensus lower bound, just from changing the point of view. if that lower bound is sufficiently large to make a security decision easy, then you're both using reputation value as a numerical quantity and yet not getting hung up on precision. Even if we cannot measure the value of information, we can ask what costs would incur if we did not have the information or if someone else did. We can ask how much equally trustable replacement information would cost us, starting from where we are and knowing what we know now. We can ask what is the price of delay while recovery happens, and thus choose between investment from making failure less likely and investment from making recovery more timely. I'm sure you know the availability calculus, which is the quotient of mean time between failures divided by mean time between failures minus mean time to repair. You get, mean time to repair divided by that difference. The point is that you get 100% availability either by making mean time between failure infinite or mean time to repair 0. So you have this range that you can work with. You know, if it's said in a number of places that, including the Bible, that a fool can ask questions that a wise man cannot answer. And in that sense, what is your information worth isn't likely to help. However, just because we cannot name a figure at 4-digit accuracy, all is far from lost. Take a look at the decision you have to make and see if that decision actually requires a precise valuation. Odds are that it does not. If it requires an inequality, like if the information is more valuable X than the right course of action is Y, we might therefore be able to get somewhere. We might be able to say that the existence of that inequality and our ability to say that we are beyond the inequality is sufficient. We don't have to have the precision of a precise number. We might therefore have two facts of life. One, that reputation is a correlate of security, and two, an inequality is good enough for decision making. One of the things that I've practiced for a long time is in the area of security metrics. I'm not interested in measurement for its own sake. I'm only interested in that kind of measurement for decision support. And this is the kind of decision support I'm talking about. I mentioned anticipation costs first because that is what everyone is already doing. I mentioned failure costs, where it is more talk and less numbers and where the specifics of the individual firm probably matter more. There is a way to pull these two together to find the minimax point where the sum of the anticipation costs and the failure costs bottoms out and the ratio of security achieved to cost expended is a maximum. The more open the corporation's business model, the more information security contracts to the point of use and value. That is to say, to the data object itself. The conventional approach to protecting information is access control, and if threat and value are rising, this means access control at ever finer grain. But access control as a security strategy suffers from complexity issues related to scale, and that access control comes down to maintaining a set of check marks in a large matrix, one where the rows are all the possible requesters of access and the columns are all the resources that they might request. Assuming that there is a finite lower bound in the cost of maintaining a single check mark in this matrix, then the overall cost of maintaining the matrix as a whole grows as the product of the number of entities that can initiate a request and the number of things that they might so request. In other words, it is geometric, not linear, in the size of the organization. A doubling of an organization's size is likely to double both its personnel and its resources, thus increasing the size of that matrix by a factor of 4. In exactly the same way, increasing the precision of our access control grows costs, going from require password at login to assign all employees to roles and all roles to program sets and allow multiple roles per person is an increase in the size of the access control matrix. Any cost that rises faster than linear with the growth of the organization is unsustainable over time. Any cost that rises faster than the complexity of environment becomes unsustainable over time. Plainly put, the economics of the access control model of information security simply don't scale. economics favors an accountability model focused on the monitoring of information use rather than the gatekeeping of information access. Not only does access control not scale, but which is worse, it both does not reach files already outside, such as on the desktop, while being perpetually at risk of getting in the way of real work. Access control is thus not a preferred alternative going forward, though throwing away existing access control systems is hardly my recommendation either. It is just time to slow or stop further investment in access control and those 4 bodyguards. Instead, the abstraction that is called for is this: security that gets in the way is security that is circumvented, but an accountability system lets things go forward that must go forward. Forensic reconstruction of an electronic accident or crime scene is expensive in proportion to the skill and authority of the attacker. So an accountability model must keep its own records and collect them proactively, not reconstruct them reactively. Some kinds of losses, especially public disclosure of private information, are essentially irreversible. So accountability has to be put into place at the leaf nodes of the network, and it has to operate in real time. As nothing is perfect, any accountability system must itself be held accountable, and that's the core abstraction. In a way, data security of the sort I'm arguing for is data security where the context matters more than the content. This used to be a rare idea, but it is becoming less so. There are numerous so-called behavioral security systems on the market that attempt to detect departures from normal, arguing that normal is assumed to be safe, while differences from normal are therefore inherently questionable. Well, that's okay to a degree, but I don't much care for the implicit, I don't know what to look for, so I will look for things that are different. You do know what to look for in the broad sense, and you will know what to look for in the narrow sense when the data in question is of particular high value. Take intellectual property, which I know has been a discussion here repeatedly. It is not hard to say what should and should not be done with it. It is not surprising that a general counsel would have a list of rules around how intellectual property is handled, even if the general counsel cannot understand a word of the science contained in them. And looking at the attendee list, I see several firms that develop intellectual property in the course of their business. Those with trade secrets likewise have something to protect, and perhaps even more so. Knowing what to do with data found in the file system tree for, say, invention disclosures requires no analysis of the invention or its disclosure. Examples of this sort are many and extend to nation-state opponents. My colleague Peter Cooper and I wrote a paper 3 years ago in which we were able to point out with an economic analysis that China, for example, cannot continue to grow at 8% per annum without engaging in substantial intellectual property theft. It cannot be done. The fact that they are growing at that speed is proof positive by itself that that is what is going on. Just as a state of security can be simply stated as the absence of unmitigatable surprises, the goal of security engineering is likewise simple: no silent failure. Failure is to be avoided whenever possible, but absolute total avoidance is sure to be diseconomic. Silent failure is pandemic. The Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report has time and again found that 80% of all data breaches are discovered not by the victim, but by an unrelated third party. With the Index of Cybersecurity, my colleague and I once asked a different one-time question, which was simply, had the respondent ever discovered a data breach at another firm, not his or her own? We got 55% yes, confirmed, another 10% yes, but unconfirmed, for a total of 65%. Since we exclude law enforcement from our catchment, I would say that our 65% and Verizon's 80% are in pretty close agreement. And in any case, that is a lot of silent failure of data protection, a lot. I have not myself actually ever worked much in the compliance arena. What I can say, however, is that compliance is what you do after problems have been identified, organized and codified into some kind of ever-after rules. Since for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, it is fair to say that compliance requirements are the reaction to previous silent failures. To take one example, California SB 1386, was a direct reaction to the silent loss of personally identifiable data by the state of California's personnel system, which just happened to include the PII of the sitting members of the legislature. As you well know, the lay press is continuing to report silent failures of data protection in the retail sector. But is it not likely that the more severe the data protection failure, the more likely it is to be silent? That is to say, there are still ones to discover, and they're probably bigger than the ones we have found so far. Our data protections have to be preemptive. When your opponent can strike without warning, without danger to him or herself, possibly even without significant chance of self-identification, then your strategy must be one of preemption and not reaction. The physical world lives by reaction, such as if you shoot your missiles at us, ours will be in the air by the time yours are even close, or shoplifters are subject to arrest and prosecution. We do not have the luxury of time necessary to make the luxury of reaction a plausible strategy for data protection. No, our strategy has to be one of preemption. Preemption requires intelligence. Intelligence requires surveillance. Time, or the absence of it, makes this so. This is not a choice or an opinion. I think it's closer to a law of physics. And with that, we face a fork in the road. What is our unit of surveillance? What do we watch? The farmer, the fox, the chickens, or the coop? In the digital sphere, where data security is our goal and the realities are as they are, our two options for a unit of observation are the person or the data object. Frankly, if those are the options, take the data object. Data object surveillance is undistracted by whether outsiders have taken over the identities of insiders. Data object surveillance is insensitive to whether the attempted but inappropriate data action is due to inadvertence or incompetence or treachery. And it is only data secure object surveillance that can signal in real enough time to trigger interceptions, if interception is what has to be done. How is data object surveillance done? You have to change the execution environment, where the passive data object is catapulted into motion, which is to say, data object surveillance has to be host-based and supply-side. It has to run at machine time and in machine space. It has to be where irreversibility of time is at its most salient, namely where data objects are instantaneously changed from at rest to in motion. It has to be at leaf nodes, whether those are desktops, mobile devices, VMs, or whatever comes next. There is nowhere else. Fight the idea if you like. I believe it will beat you. There's just no point in mincing words here. It is a fact of nature that you cannot prove a negative, that is to say that something did not happen, except in one case. If you log everything that did happen, then and only then can you say what did not happen, because then and only then is the absence of evidence equal to the evidence of absence. Only thoroughgoing data surveillance provides thoroughgoing data protection, including you being able to satisfy others that you are serious about data protection by proving that you have been so. Allowing no failures to be silent is, at the end of the day, more meaningful than that there are no failures. And yes, this is quite obnoxious at some level. Speaking as a gentleman, looking me in the eye while shaking my hand over a deal is to be preferred. But the developers of the internet delivered location independence, which morphed into location irrelevance, and with that change, the possibility of attribution for attacks ended. Surveillance of data use is the price of location-independent data access. Whatever you don't surveil is where silent failures and the surprise that silent failure enables will originate. You know, I quoted Einstein before, that it is indeed insane to keep doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Something has to give. Change has to happen. Every attendee here has made the choice to take steps not yet widely taken, as this meeting's theme implies, to not only make change, but to be a change agent as well, to lead by example in laying down the tools and weapons that may once have worked, but which will no longer do, and to recenter your security regime around data, rather than infrastructure, around accountability, rather than access control, around minimizing what it is you didn't know that you didn't know, so as to minimize surprises. A context-driven, data-centric regime is one where what you observe is what matters, and the way in which you observe it inherently minimizes surprises in a way that makes them more likely to be mitigatable because the regime picks them up earlier, independently of the background noise that complexity otherwise brings. In the end, reality always wins, and wishful thinking always loses. That eventuality may not be instant, just as John Maynard Keynes said when he put it when he said that the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. But on the relentlessly accelerating timescale of data accumulation and data protection, I don't think there's a long wait in store before nearly every firm has to come to the conclusion that their data is more valuable the better it is protected, and that to allow themselves to be surprised over and over is to play some kind of Russian roulette within the legal system. The change agency that you have taken up is especially that of setting an example. If you and I are right about this matter, then those who are not following your lead will in due course come to grief, while those who do, as you have done, and adopt data-centric security will live another day. You've embraced my definition of security, the absence of unmitigatable surprises, just as you've embraced the pinnacle goal of security engineering, no silent failure. In making those two commitments, you've also achieved the objectives of forensic readiness, which is namely to maximize your environment's ability to collect credible digital evidence, and two, to minimize your costs of forensics during incident response. I salute you, therefore, as change agents. In my humble opinion, early adopters are what steer the world. There are a good number of supposed ways to measure technical progression, but my favorite one is entirely colloquial. One, you have an inspiration. Two, you can actually make it run. Three, you can convince other people to try it. Four, you stop getting asked why you are doing this. Five, other people start getting asked why they aren't. For data-centric security, I think we're between 4 and 5. That it is, you are likely not getting asked much anymore why you are doing it, but rather others are just beginning to be asked why they are not. In that, I salute you, particularly those who are willing to share here what you have learned. There's never enough time. Thank you for yours.